our little series about Fourier series. So let's talk about what happens when you put a Fourier series through a filter. So imagine we have a filter sitting around here, some sort of system with a frequency response, big H of j omega, whatever it is. Remember this big H j omega, just for context, this is we can compute this from the impulse response, where the impulse response of the system is little h of t. This is the impulse response in the time domain, e to the minus j omega t dt. And we have mentioned before, this is a Fourier transform. It's the frequency response is the Fourier transform of the impulse response. We have not, if you're in 3084, at this point in the course, we haven't really talked about Fourier transforms in a lot of detail yet, but that is coming. But suppose somebody's done this for you and they've given this to you, and you put a signal through here. So remember, the general idea is if you've got e to the j, let's say some omega t, omega naught t that goes in here, what you get out is you get the same sort of complex exponential that's going in, where I've got e to the j omega naught t going in, and what comes out, though, has a different magnitude and phase. And that magnitude and phase is determined by this complex number, the frequency response that you get from plugging in the particular omega naught that corresponds to the frequency that's actually going in. So because this is dependent on the frequency, makes sense, it's a frequency response, you can build this to turn up the bass or turn up the treble. There's a song that's on the radio right now that talks about bass and treble, and I won't discuss that further here. But anyway, if you think about that, this tells us the way the system responds to a certain kind of building block, where that building block is a complex exponential. It's a sinusoid. And if you have now a periodic function that's written in terms of these building blocks, in other words, this Fourier series, e to the j omega naught kt, if this is input to your system, we now know what the output's going to look like. Because this system is a linear time invariant system, I should have said that up front, sort of implied by the fact that I mentioned a frequency response. If it's not linear time invariant, then the strict notion of having a frequency response doesn't make a lot of sense. But assuming this is a linear time invariant system, I have a sum of complex of exponentials going in. And so I'll have a sum of these complex exponentials coming out by this particular property here. If you've taken a class in linear algebra, or I think in Georgia Tech, that's maybe in Calculus 2 or Calculus 3 or something, I can't remember, you've probably encountered the idea of an eigenvalue and an eigenvector for a matrix. This is the same kind of idea. You could say for a linear time invariant system, these complex exponentials are eigenfunctions, sort of playing the role of an eigenvector for a matrix. And this frequency response here, these are eigenvalues. So there are some similar ideas here. And if you get into graduate level signal processing, there's a lot of mileage you can get out of this kind of concept of thinking about things in terms of linear algebra. We won't get too much into that sort of thing here. So if this is what goes in, well, I have a sum of things going in. So I'll have a sum of things coming out, all with appropriate weights. And the thing that comes out, well, that's just going to be this sum. So I'll write this k going from minus infinity to infinity. I'll have this ak. But now, each of these is going to get multiplied by this frequency response. Let me actually write it up here so I've got more space. So let's clear out some space here. Let's write what the output is up here. Need to go back in pen mode in order to flip my pen here over and use it as an eraser. So there we go. I'm making some space, singing the space making song. Okay, So what comes out here? What is this yt? So the output is going to be another sum of these kinds of outputs for these particular kinds of inputs. By linearity, I can say, okay, well, the output is going to be a sum of these building blocks, but they're going to be multiplied by the frequencies, by this frequency response at the frequencies that are going in. So here I wrote it in terms of some omega naught, but you can write the same sort of thing and put k's in front, or whatever your frequency is. So what am I getting out? I'll have this original Fourier series coefficient ak, but I'm multiplying it now by this frequency response, evaluated at these various frequencies. But I still got frequencies of the, there needs to be a k here. J omega naught kt coming out. So notice that going through an LTI system, if I'm putting a signal in here, I can't create new frequencies with an LTI system. I can take frequency components that are already there and I could eliminate them if I had a filter that set this to 0. I might change their magnitude and phase. The magnitude and phase of these frequency components going in is indicated by these AKs. I may change the magnitude and phase using this big H, but I can't actually create new frequencies that weren't in input. It's an important property of linear time invariant systems to understand. If you put a signal in and you get frequencies in your output and they weren't in the input, it means that your system cannot have been an LTI system. Somebody told you it was, they're pulling a fast one on you. But anyway, if you look at this output, this is just another Fourier series. Here I have a Fourier series with Fourier series coefficients ak. Well, this is in the same form of a Fourier series. The output is also a Fourier series. Just maybe with new Fourier series coefficients, I'll call these bk. So I had Fourier series coefficients ak going in. This is a very loose thing, you know, I'm really putting in the signal x of t with these Fourier series coefficients. The Fourier series coefficients coming out are the same as the ones going in. They just get multiplied by your frequency response evaluated at these various frequencies. So very beautiful, very general concept. And you can play games of saying, okay, well, what do things look like for different kinds of filters? So if I were to remember what we had for the particular case of our square wave, remember the Fourier series coefficients look something like this if I plotted them on a frequency axis. So for the square wave, we had this kind of form. And these keep going. So the this is terribly not to scale. It's 1/2 here. The Fourier series coefficients after that sloped off. You can get those from previous videos. Alternating sign, plus minus, along the odd harmonics. So let's say here's 0, omega naught, 2 omega naught. There's minus omega naught over here, and so on in both directions. You can ask, well, what does the output look like for different kinds of filters? Now, if I gave it a filter with the big H with some complicated thing, you would have to just, you know, get your calculator or MATLAB or your brain and compute that. Just for the sake of discussion, let's talk about a particular kind of filter. Let's talk about an ideal low-pass filter. So maybe I'll put an ideal low-pass filter that is, say, nope, I don't want that one. Can I Control Z? Can I undo there? Okay. So say I have a filter that goes from 2 omega naught to 2 omega naught. Sorry, from minus 2 omega naught to 2 omega naught, and it's 1 between there, and a 0 outside of that. So this is an ideal low-pass filter. A little bit later, you'll see why we can't actually build this filter in practice. You can spend more money, you can put in more complexity, etc., etc. Ultimately, in practice, you'll only be able to deal with something that approximates this. You're always going to have some sort of slope-off, so there's always engineering approximations to be made. But quite often, to analyze or design systems, we'll just assume a ideal low-pass filter, and that'll be fine. So if you pass this through here, well, there's only 3 lines here that survive. There's this fundamental that's 1/2, and there's these things over to the side. Now, previously we computed that A1 was 1 over 3 pi. Here's 3 naught in terms of the frequency. So A3 was 1 over, it was minus 1 over 5 pi. But in this particular case, if this is my filter, none of these others survive. So my Fourier series, I have A naught plus A1 e to the j omega naught t plus a minus 1 e to the minus j omega naught t. These are the only ones that survive. This should be multiplied, not a giant space. And that's going to be my signal. Everything else is getting killed off by my filter. And in this particular case, I could rewrite this readily with Euler's formula. So this particular case, A naught is 1/2. Well, this A1 and this A minus 1, that's 1 over 3 pi. But notice I have a term. I have a conjugate version of that. I have a complex sinusoid. I have its complex conjugate version. And these are both just 1 over 3 pi. So I can use Euler's formula here and rewrite this as 2 over 3 pi. So the 2 is what you get back from going from this exponential form back to the cosine. And let me go ahead and just write this as cosine omega naught t, whatever that fundamental frequency is, and you're done. If I had if the filter was a little bit different, suppose the filter went all the way out now to minus 4 omega naught to 4 omega naught. Suppose that's how far my filter went. Well, I would still not have the A7 term. I still wouldn't have the A5 term or the A9 term and all that. But now that A5 term would come into play, and now there would be a couple ways you could write this. Here you could write this as 1 over 5 pi. It's the same as both of them. Cosine 3, I'm sorry. This is actually just 1 over pi. This is 1 over 3 pi. There. So this is just 2 over pi. And this is 1 over 3 pi. Sorry, it's 2 in the morning. I probably should not be trying to do these at 2 in the morning. Also found, it turns out trying to lecture to your laptop sitting in your kitchen when everyone else in the house is asleep and nobody's around is very weird and disorienting. Anyway. So this is 1 over 3 pi. And then I have a 2 here going from this exponential form back to the cosine. Now, you might... having the minus here is a little weird because everything here really is... If you think about the phases, they're either 0 or pi. It makes sense to have a plus or minus here. Similarly, if you had something where everything had j's in a particular way, it might be convenient to write these as signs. In general, you usually want to write these as things with a positive coefficient, cosine, something t, plus, plus some phase. That's usually the way you want to write this. So you might rewrite this as plus 2 over 3 pi cosine 3 omega naught t plus pi. But here I'm not sure it makes things look any easier. But now, if you start to add these terms in, you can really start to get a sense for what how these things work. So if we included just these first two terms, you would have a sinusoid centered at 1/2. Okay, that's probably the world's worst drawn sinusoid, but you get the idea. And doesn't look a terrible lot like a square wave, but even if you just add this next term in here, what you wind up with is something where you basically get a couple of horns on your sine wave. Not doing the time scale terribly good either, but you get the idea. I hope you get the idea. Things start to flatten out fairly quickly. And once you've had a fifth term and the fifth term and the seventh term and the ninth term, remember for this particular wave the even harmonics are missing, this thing starts to flatten out. If you look in the write-up, there's this weird phenomena called the Gibbs effect. So these little horns on the net, the discontinuities, these show up in general. These don't just show up for square waves. Anytime you have a signal with a discontinuity, and you're trying to represent with the Fourier series, you have this weird effect where these horns, they sort of get smaller in width, but they never quite go away. And this whole thing in here could be flattening out as you're adding more and more terms in. And you'll see that if you pull up MATLAB and you start trying to compute, add up these things and visualize them. This is called a Gibbs phenomena, and there's some depth under there. Turns out when we wrote x of t equals sum blah 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 for the Fourier series, that really only strictly works for continuous signals. If you have something with a discontinuity that x of t equals sum ak e to the j k omega naught t, that equal sign only holds in a more general sense that people would call a mean square sense. If you want to dig into the details of that, it's fascinating. There's a lot of deep math under there. Just know in general, we're kind of pulling a fast one on you when we say equals. It's not a point-wise equals. There's something very strange that happens at these discontinuities that requires more careful mathematical treatment. Again, for the purposes of, say, ECE3084 at Georgia Tech, we won't need to dig into that level of detail. But if you start using this stuff for something in grad school, you want to pay attention to it in more detail. And you'll see things like this on lab and on the oscilloscope. If you take a square wave generator and whatever it is, and you hook some coax from your generator to your scope, and you start, expanding the time scale on your scope to look at this level of detail, you'll see that on the scope. And essentially what is happening there is there's so many physical processes in your measurement apparatus that are going to cut off high frequencies. The signal generator itself has some upper limit of its bandwidth that it can handle well. The coax will have a certain amount of capacitance. You will kind of form a capacitor with the circuit. If you spend a lot of time dealing with circuits on breadboards or even on PCB, if you start poking around with your fingers, be careful not to shock yourself or whatever. Even sometimes just having your fingers near a circuit, that extra capacitance can change the operation of that circuit in weird ways. And all of those capacitors wind up coupling with resistances basically to form low-pass filter kind of effects. Capacitors can also be used to build high-pass filters, but the kind of effect we're talking about is where you'll get a lot of stray capacitances that limit your ability to measure very high frequencies. So it's equivalent kind of to building up a Fourier series where you're just chopping off a lot of the higher order terms. And you'll see that on an oscilloscope. So that does indeed come up. So the final little trick I want to mention here in terms of computing things with Fourier series coefficients is that most of the time for, say, the signals we'll be looking at in ECE3084 at Georgia Tech, but for that matter, a lot of signals out in the wild are real valued signals. We'll see a little bit later in 3084, sometimes there's good reason to talk about complex valued signals beyond just their mathematical convenience of dealing with complex exponentials instead of dealing with cosines and sinusoids. But in general, our x of t's are going to be real. So we'll say if x of t is real, it's not too hard to show yourself that the Fourier series coefficients will have a certain kind of symmetry. So a minus k is going to equal ak with a complex conjugate. Again, this only holds in general if x of t is real valued. But what this means is that your Fourier series coefficients, minus 3 versus 3 or minus 5 versus 5, they have the same magnitude, but the phase is different by a sign flip. And if you think about it and think about Euler's formula, that makes sense. Euler's formula gives you a real cosine term and imaginary sine term. So if this is real, in order to get those imaginary parts to cancel, you'll need to have that kind of conjugate symmetry. So that often can save you some time in thinking about these things, because you know one's just a complex conjugate of the other. And we'll use that kind of symmetry throughout ECE3084 if you're taking that class at Georgia Tech. The final thing that I wanted to mention here sort of has to do with something that the math department does, or I should say most math textbooks. So in EE, we really like to write these things in terms of complex exponentials. Complex exponentials, they're used a lot in circuits classes for phasors, you know. That's really a first introduction to system signals concepts in a circuits class for AC circuits. Sorry, I was yawning there. It's now 2:15 in the morning. So these are awfully convenient. JK omega naught T. So if you do have a real signal, so let's suppose for a second that x of t is real. If you use that conjugate symmetry, we can write this another way. There's an a naught component that hangs out on its own. But now, because of that symmetry, the a1, the a minus 1, the a2, the a minus 2, etc., we'll be able to write all of the wiggly parts of the signal, the x of t, as cosines. So using Euler's formula going from here, I've got twice whatever the magnitude is. Again, that's the 2 you need going from the this complex conjugate, complex exponential form to form with an actual real cosine, times cosine omega naught kt plus, in this case, it's the angle of the AK. Something like that. And this is a nice way to think about it. You know, this is generally more convenient in terms of thinking about what the AKs are and using the Fourier analysis integral, where you're finding the AK. It's usually easier to use this form. But to think about it, well, what are you adding up? It's a bunch of cosines. If x of t is real, these are all cosines of some magnitude and phase. Now, going back to the math department, a lot of math books, a lot of those tend to avoid this complex exponential notation. I mean, that said, there's hundreds and thousands of papers and textbooks written about math that use this kind of notation. But quite often, you will see people using a Fourier series notation that actually has sines and cosines in it. So you might see something like, don't quote me on this, but you'll see something like, well, they'll say that we have a sum, we'll have some sort of maybe a naught representing a DC value. Well, actually, no, this will work. I can go ahead and do it like this. We'll say k equals 1 to infinity. Let's say it's capital A naught of cosine. I don't really like that. I don't want you to get confused here. Let's make them big C's. Big C. Okay, big C naught, cosine, omega naught, kt, like that. And then they'll have another term with a sign. But everything being pi, except this one, I think we really need to start that guy at 0 for this to work out. So we'll start him at 0. So this needs to not be 0 either. This is k. So this C0 could correspond to your cosine term here, and that's just 1. And then for your k here, for your sine terms, we'll say, okay, well, this is now sine omega naught kt. And these have different coefficients. Let's maybe call them d. We'll call them dk. So this is what you'll see in math textbooks. And you'll see the formula for figuring out your cosine, to figure out your big C's that has a sine in it. Your formula for figuring out these sines will have a cosine in it. So it's very similar, but they have the split. So instead of having this big set of AKs, they'll have a big set of, let's say, capital C's and a big set of, say, capital D's. Now, it's not too hard to show that these are equivalent. You can pick big C and a big D there, here that's going to match some particular choice of AKs here. And essentially these CKs and DKs conspire to give you the cosine of the right magnitude, and they'll conspire to give for those cosines to all have the correct angles. But I don't really like this form, because writing as two things like this makes you think that there's sort of twice as many sinusoids going on as there aren't. No, if you think about phasor addition for the same K, these have the same frequencies, these add together to give you a single cosine. And you can sit down and work out what the relationship between the little AKs and the big C and the big D here are. But I just think this kind of form is misleading. I think it's better to think about it in this kind of way. This is clearly, in this form, is only really usable for real signals. This also generalizes to complex signals readily if you have a reason to do that. Okay, so there's our review of ideas of Fourier series and going through the filter. And that's the